It all started on a sunny Saturday morning. I was sitting in my living room, sipping coffee, and enjoying the peace that only a non-HOA property can offer. No rules, no restrictions, just the freedom to do whatever I wanted. Little did I know, my quiet life was about to take a turn for the bizarre. A knock at the door shattered my peace. It wasn't just any knock. It was frantic, loud, and repeated. I opened the door to find an angry woman standing there, her face flushed with frustration. Before I could even ask what was going on, she snapped, "I need you to move your car. You're blocking the road." This wasn't the first time someone had complained about parking, but what came next took things to a whole new level. The woman introduced herself as Karen from the local homeowners association, HOA. Now, if you've ever had the misfortune of dealing with someone from an HOA, you know exactly what I mean when I say the power trip is real. They act like they have absolute authority over the world around them, as if they can dictate every inch of your life, from the color of your front door to how many steps you're allowed to take outside on a Sunday afternoon. And that sense of entitlement isn't just limited to their own properties. It extends to anyone in their vicinity. If you're not careful, they'll start to act like your personal life and choices are somehow theirs to control. For them, it's all about the rules they claim are there to maintain peace and order. But let's face it, most of the time, it's just about their need to feel powerful. And that was exactly the vibe I was getting from this Karen. At first glance, she didn't appear too threatening. She had that typical middle-aged, disapproving aura about her, one that you might associate with an elementary school teacher who was always trying to enforce the dress code. Her bright red lipstick and the way her arms were crossed over her chest immediately put me on alert. That stance wasn't just a defensive posture. It was an announcement of, "I'm in charge here, and you'll listen to me, whether you like it or not." I stood in front of my house, a little taken aback, trying to process what she was saying. Karen didn't waste any time getting straight to the point. "I need you to move your car," she ordered. The tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't even polite. It was cold, demanding. "You're blocking the road. You can't do that here." She was practically seething, as if I had somehow wronged her personally by merely existing on my own property. Now, my house isn't located in a traditional HOA community. It's nestled in a quiet, non-HOA area, where we get the luxury of living without some stranger telling us how to trim our bushes or when to pick up our mail. It's peaceful, and the best part? We don't have to answer to anyone. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, free from the prying eyes of people who believed they had the right to regulate every detail of my life. But here she was, this Karen from the HOA, standing on my doorstep, expecting me to obey her arbitrary rules. I took a deep breath and tried to maintain my composure. "I'm sorry, but I don't belong to your HOA," I explained calmly, hoping that would make things clear. "I'm not concerned about your neighborhood's parking rules." That should have been the end of it, right? I was polite. I explained the situation, and I had every right to park in front of my own house. But Karen wasn't going to let it go so easily. She tilted her head, narrowed her eyes, and stared at me as though I had just committed some unspeakable crime. Her gaze felt cold, almost like a personal insult. "You should still follow the rules of the neighborhood," she snapped back, her voice rising slightly in volume, as if she was talking to a child who had misbehaved. I could hear the irritation in her voice, like she was trying to force me to comply with her nonsensical demand. This wasn't about parking anymore. It was about control. And I wasn't about to let this woman think she had any authority over me, especially in a place that wasn't even under her purview. I stared at her for a moment, trying to hold back the frustration building in me. Who was this woman to tell me what I could and couldn't do on my own property? She didn't even know me, and yet she acted like she had the right to impose her will. "I don't owe anyone any explanation about how I use my property," I said, my tone firm but not angry. "I'm not part of your HOA, and I don't have to follow your rules. I'll park wherever I choose." Her face flushed, and she scoffed, turning away from me like I had just insulted her entire existence. She didn't even try to argue anymore. Instead, she just huffed loudly, muttering something under her breath about inconsiderate people and lack of community spirit. The way she stormed off made it clear that she had a sense of entitlement, but also a belief that I should have simply folded to her demands. As if because she was part of the HOA, she was somehow better, more important, more deserving of having things go her way. I thought that would be the end of it. I assumed she'd walk away, sulking like the typical HOA member who couldn't get what they wanted, and we'd both go back to our lives. I mean, after all, what more could she do? I didn't live in her neighborhood. I didn't have to follow her rules. I had already told her that. So naturally, I assumed it would all blow over. But oh, how wrong I was. What I didn't realize at the time was that Karen had a few tricks up her sleeve, ones that didn't involve simple face-to-face confrontations. She wasn't just going to accept my refusal and move on. No, she was the type of person who wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. And as I soon discovered, this wouldn't be the last time I'd see Karen. In fact, that was just the beginning of a strange series of events that would turn my peaceful life upside down. I had no idea that in her mind, her HOA membership gave her the right to intrude on my life, my property, and my sense of peace. Little did I know, she would stop at nothing to make sure I followed her rules, even if it meant crossing a line I never saw coming. So, when I saw her again a few days later, standing in front of my house with a smug smile, I knew that things were about to take a very different turn. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to apologize for wanting to live my life on my terms. And as I braced myself for the confrontation that was inevitably coming, I realized that this wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about principle. It was about defending my right to live freely without being controlled by someone who thought their HOA gave them the right to tell me how to live. And trust me, that was just the beginning of the storm that Karen would unleash upon my life. The next morning, I woke up to a noise I wasn't used to hearing. It wasn't the usual hum of birds chirping or the sound of wind rustling through the trees. No, this was different. This was the rumbling sound of large engines revving up, the unmistakable roar of buses, and the jarring sound of tires on pavement. My heart immediately began to race as I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the remnants of sleep. I stumbled out of bed and went to my window, pulling the blinds apart, half expecting it to be some kind of dream. But when I looked out, I was met with a scene that made my stomach drop. To my complete horror, there were 10 large buses parked along the street in front of my house. I blinked twice, trying to make sense of the sight. What was going on? Why were there so many buses? And who were these people? My mind raced, but I couldn't quite put the pieces together. There was something wrong about this, something that didn't sit right. Who in their right mind would send 10 buses full of strangers to my house? The feeling of disbelief turned into unease, and before I knew it, a strange sense of dread crept over me. I quickly threw on some clothes and rushed down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from outside, and the sound of the bus's doors opening and closing with a heavy thud. I wanted to run back into the safety of my house and lock the doors behind me, but something told me I needed to face whatever this was head-on. The curiosity mixed with an underlying fear was overwhelming. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't a normal situation. As I made my way out the door and into the front yard, I could see a steady stream of people stepping off the buses, one by one. Most of them appeared to be elderly folks, some with walkers, others with canes, and a few who were being helped by companions. The sight of so many strangers flooding my front yard was surreal, like something out of a bizarre dream. They were all so cheerful, chatting with one another, and making their way toward my lawn with an air of familiarity, as if they belonged there. But the moment I saw Karen at the front of the group, waving her arms enthusiastically, I knew exactly what was going on. Karen, of course, the woman from the HOA, who had already caused me so much trouble. My stomach sank even further. What was she doing here with all of these people? Why had she brought them to my property? Was this some kind of joke, or was she seriously trying to force me into something I didn't want? Welcome, everyone. Karen's voice rang out loudly, almost triumphantly. She had a grin on her face that I could only describe as smug, like she had just pulled off the greatest move of her life. She was so pleased with herself. It was as if she had been planning this for weeks. And suddenly, it dawned on me. This was no accident. This was no random group of people. She had orchestrated this entire situation, and she was doing it with the kind of determination that only someone like Karen could muster. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was almost as if she thought this was perfectly normal, as if I was the one who was being unreasonable by questioning her actions. The audacity of it all. It was infuriating. I couldn't just stand there and watch this unfold. My heart was racing now, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from anger. I felt the adrenaline surge through my body as I marched straight toward Karen, cutting through the sea of people that had already started to settle on my lawn. The elderly guests were starting to unfold chairs, setting up picnic tables, and even spreading blankets out on the grass. It was as if they had planned to stay for hours, if not longer. The sight of this, people in my personal space, on my property, without my permission, was the last straw. "What is this?" I asked, my voice shaky at first, but quickly finding its strength. I could feel the blood rushing to my face. My voice wavered between disbelief and frustration. "What are you doing here? Why are all these people on my property?" Karen looked at me as if she hadn't just completely crossed a line. "Oh, don't be such a spoilsport," she said with an exaggerated roll of her eyes, her arms flailing about dramatically. "I thought your yard would be the perfect place for a little gathering. You don't have an HOA telling you what you can and can't do, so I figured it would be fine." I stared at her, my jaw hanging open. "You figured what?" I managed to stammer, trying to process the insanity of her words. "You thought you could just bring 10 buses full of people to my house? Without asking, without even telling me about it? Are you serious right now?" She didn't seem to think she was doing anything wrong. In fact, she was beaming, completely oblivious to the anger that was bubbling up inside me. "Oh, relax," she said, brushing it off as though it were no big deal. "It's just a little event. We're just going to enjoy the day, have some food, and chat. It'll be fun. You'll see." I was absolutely floored. How could she think this was okay? How could she just assume that I would be fine with a huge group of strangers invading my personal space? There was no asking for permission, no consideration for my feelings, nothing. She was treating my home like a public park, and she was acting like I should be grateful for it. I wanted to shout at her, tell her to leave, tell her that this wasn't a public space, but somehow I kept it together. My hands clenched into fists as I tried to process what was happening. I took a few steps toward her, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Karen," I said, my tone now firm and cold, "this is not your property. You can't just send buses of people here without my consent. You need to get them off my lawn now." She tilted her head, her smile faltering for the first time. "Oh, come on," she protested. "It's not like I'm doing anything wrong. It's just a little gathering. Don't be so uptight. Everyone's having a great time." But I wasn't having a great time. The realization that I was being forced into this situation was sinking in like a heavy weight. I looked around at the elderly people, most of them now sitting on the grass or under a tree, chatting amongst themselves. They seemed perfectly content, oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing, that they didn't belong here. It didn't matter that they were all so cheerful. It didn't matter that they were having a good time. None of that changed the fact that this was my property, and Karen had crossed a line by bringing them here without my permission. I had to take action. This couldn't continue. Karen didn't miss a beat. She smiled that smile, the kind of smile that made your skin crawl, the one that says, "I'm in control, and you're going to have to deal with it whether you like it or not." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her words hit me like a freight train, and for a split second, I just stood there, blinking at her in disbelief, trying to make sense of what she had just said. "I've planned a lovely neighborhood event for all of us to enjoy," Karen declared, her voice filled with pride, as if she were unveiling the grandest plan ever conceived. She beamed like a child who had just brought home an A+ paper. "I thought your property would be perfect for this gathering, since you don't have an HOA to stop you." She said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like I was somehow the one who had it wrong, for not being okay with this invasion. I stood there, completely dumbfounded. My jaw dropped slightly as I processed her words, trying to connect the dots. "You did what?" I managed to ask, though my voice barely sounded like my own. I repeated the question, but louder this time, as if somehow that might make the situation clearer. "You did what?" I looked around, trying to take in the surreal scene unfolding before me. The elderly people were still casually setting up on my lawn, unfolding chairs, spreading blankets, pulling out coolers filled with snacks. The whole thing was so surreal, I thought I might be dreaming. There were 10 buses parked along my street, each one full of people, their faces flushed with excitement and joy. My front yard, which was always so peaceful, was now a sea of strangers. And here was Karen, acting like she had just invited a few friends over for tea. I couldn't process the magnitude of what she was telling me. This wasn't just a small neighborhood barbecue or a casual gathering of a few people. No, this was a full-scale, orchestrated event, one that involved 10 chartered buses. 10, for crying out loud. That was no mistake. She had planned this down to the last detail, and she had done it all without consulting me, without even so much as an invitation, an apology, or any consideration for my boundaries. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks, and I felt my stomach twist. She had literally brought a massive group of people to my private property without permission. She thought she could simply waltz in, claim my front yard as her venue, and expect me to just roll with it, as though I was some kind of public resource for her to use at her leisure. I tried to keep my voice steady as I spoke, but the anger was bubbling up, threatening to spill over. "You can't just bring a bunch of people here without my permission," I protested, my voice rising with frustration. The words felt too weak, too calm, too restrained for the storm of emotions that was building inside of me. I wanted to yell. I wanted to scream at her, but I knew that wasn't going to help. The situation was already absurd enough, and I didn't want to escalate things further. But the audacity, how could she do this? How could she assume that she could just decide what happens on my property? Karen's smile never faltered. She didn't seem the least bit rattled by my response. Instead, she dismissed my concerns with an airy wave of her hand, as though my objections were the least important thing in the world. "Oh, don't be so uptight," she said, her tone condescending, like she was speaking to a child. She was completely unfazed, like she was trying to make me feel silly for not embracing this wonderful idea she had clearly spent zero time considering from my perspective. "It's just a little fun. You know, a neighborhood get-together. We all need to relax and enjoy ourselves. What's the harm?" The words hung in the air, and I swear they made my blood boil. It wasn't about fun. It wasn't about a get-together. It was about a fundamental lack of respect for my space, my boundaries, and my autonomy. How could she be so blasé about this? How could she act like it was all just one big, happy party that I should be thrilled to host without any prior discussion? I could feel my face flush with heat as I tried to keep my composure. How was this even happening? The absurdity of it all was almost overwhelming. Was this woman for real? Had she lost her mind? Or was she just so wrapped up in her own sense of entitlement that she genuinely couldn't fathom why I might object to a massive crowd on my lawn without my consent? I took a step forward, closer to Karen, wanting to make my point crystal clear. "This is my property," I said, enunciating each word slowly, hoping she would finally grasp the magnitude of the situation. "You cannot just decide to bring a crowd of strangers onto my lawn and expect me to be okay with it." But Karen wasn't done yet. No, she wasn't going to let go that easily. She stood there, hands on her hips, surveying the scene with a smug expression on her face. It was as if she thought I was being difficult, like I was somehow in the wrong for not welcoming a bunch of random people into my personal space. Her attitude didn't change, her smile didn't waver, and I could tell she wasn't taking me seriously. "Well, it's a community event," she said, the way she said community, making it sound like she had invented the word herself, as if she had single-handedly brought the concept of togetherness to life. "It's important that we all come together and support one another, don't you think? You know, just a little bit of fun for the neighborhood. It's good for the spirit." My blood pressure spiked. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to tell her how wrong she was, how completely off the mark she was with this whole idea. But instead, I just stood there, speechless for a moment, feeling a wave of frustration wash over me. How could she not get it? How could she honestly believe that this was okay? "You think this is good for the spirit?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. You think barging in on someone's private property without their permission is somehow good for the spirit? Karen didn't seem to see anything wrong with her behavior. Instead, she seemed puzzled by my outrage. It's just a little event. No harm done. Relax, will you? She waved her hand dismissively, as though my objections were something to be laughed off. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My home. My property. She thought she could just take it over for her own amusement, as if I had no say in the matter. It was maddening, frustrating, and completely disrespectful. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what was happening. I had every right to be upset, every right to tell her to leave, but it felt like she was steamrolling over my boundaries, pushing and pushing until I caved. And for the first time, I wasn't sure how to stop it. I couldn't believe what was happening. The weight of the moment hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Here I was, standing in my own front yard, watching in disbelief as Karen, this woman who barely knew me, had the audacity to send 10 buses full of people to my property. Not only that, but she had already assumed that I would be fine with it, that I would just roll over and let them take over my space, my home. My stomach twisted with a mixture of frustration and anger. How had things gotten this far? I had given her every opportunity to see reason, to understand that this wasn't okay. But Karen was so consumed with her own plans and ideas that she couldn't see beyond her sense of entitlement. She thought she could do whatever she wanted, that because she wasn't governed by an HOA, I was somehow obligated to accommodate her and her guests. I tried to reason with her again, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and growing anger. Karen, you can't just bring a whole group of people here without asking for my permission first. I said, my voice rising, louder this time, as if trying to get through to her. This is my property. You can't just treat it like it's public space. You can't do this. But she simply waved me off. Her response wasn't one of apology or even a semblance of guilt. No, she was already too far into the planning of her little picnic to care. Her eyes didn't even flicker with recognition of my discomfort. Instead, she looked past me, already making plans for where the picnic tables would go, deciding where the folding chairs should be set up, as if she were the host of a wedding reception, as if it were already a done deal. A flare of anger sparked deep inside me, and I could feel the heat of it rising to my face. I had reached my breaking point. Something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I stormed over to the gate at the entrance to my property. The familiar weight of the iron gate felt like a comforting solid object against my fury, and I grabbed the sturdy latch, my hands shaking with both rage and disbelief. With a loud, sharp noise, I slammed the gate shut with all the force I could muster. The heavy thud reverberated through the quiet of the neighborhood, a decisive statement that I was not backing down. I could feel the tension mounting in the air. My breath was quick and shallow as I threw the bolt on the gate, locking it tight. There was no hesitation now. I wasn't about to let this woman, or anyone else, think they could just waltz onto my property as if I didn't have the right to say no. The finality of the bolt sliding into place brought a strange sense of relief, a fleeting moment of victory. For once, I felt in control again, standing firm in my decision. But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Karen, of course, didn't take kindly to being told no. She marched up to the gate, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. She came closer, but I held my ground. "You can't just lock me out," she shouted, her voice high and full of indignation, as if I had personally attacked her. She grasped the bars of the gate, rattling them, trying to force her way through, but the gate stood strong. It wasn't just an obstacle. It was a symbol of my refusal to let her and her army of strangers violate my personal space. "You need to let us in," she demanded. "I've organized this entire event. The buses are already here. You can't just lock the gate and ruin it all. This is our neighborhood event, and you're being a party pooper." I wanted to shout back, to unleash all the anger I felt in that moment, but I kept it together, speaking calmly, though my voice shook with suppressed fury. "No one is entering my property without my say-so, Karen," I told her, trying to keep my voice as steady as possible. The words felt like a declaration, like I was laying down the law in my own space. "If you want a picnic, you'll have to find somewhere else to have it." I could feel the weight of those words as they left my mouth. Words that felt like a final boundary, a clear and unyielding statement of my refusal. Karen's face flushed with anger, and her hands tightened around the bars of the gate as though she were trying to push the entire thing open with sheer force of will. But no matter how hard she pulled, the gate didn't budge. She was up against something stronger than her willpower now. Behind her, the group of guests began to notice the commotion. I could hear the murmur of voices growing louder as the once jovial atmosphere began to change. People started glancing around, uncertain of what was happening. The older men and women, who had been chatting and laughing just moments before, began to shift in their seats, exchanging confused looks. Some of them stood up, unsure whether to stay or leave. They could sense something was off, and the energy of the event started to shift, the carefree atmosphere replaced by a lingering tension. I could see some of them looking at Karen, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They hadn't been part of the confrontation, but now they were beginning to realize that they had been brought into something that wasn't as simple as a friendly neighborhood gathering. They were standing on my property without my permission, and the more they looked around, the more they seemed to understand that they weren't supposed to be there. But Karen wasn't done yet. No, she wasn't about to let go of her little event so easily. She stepped back from the gate for a moment, giving me a death glare that could have burned a hole through concrete. Then, she turned back to her guests and started talking to them as though she were still in charge. She raised her voice, clearly trying to rally them to her side. "Don't listen to him," she shouted over her shoulder. "This is a community event. We've been planning this for weeks. He's just being difficult." Some of the guests hesitated, clearly torn. I could see a few older women exchanging concerned glances, as though wondering what to do. Were they really part of something that was so wrong? Were they really going to stay here, on someone else's property, when it was clear that the homeowner didn't want them there? A few guests slowly started to pack up their things, murmuring to each other as they began to leave, realizing that perhaps this wasn't such a good idea after all. But Karen, ever the force of nature, refused to let go. "No, stay here. Don't let him ruin our day," she yelled. Her voice cracked with desperation. The pride in her tone had faded, replaced by a sense of entitlement so strong it was palpable. The situation had become so uncomfortable that I could practically feel the guests shrinking away from her, unsure of how to handle the confrontation. Some stayed, clearly too polite or uncertain to leave, while others made a hasty retreat back to the buses, their faces a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. At that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. Standing there in front of my gate, holding my ground, I realized that I had to protect my space, my home, no matter how entitled Karen felt to take it over. She had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let her dictate what happened on my property. No amount of her forceful words or misguided sense of community was going to change that. She could try to rally her guests all she wanted, but in the end, it was my property, and I wasn't backing down. Karen stormed up to the locked gate, her face now twisted with fury. I could hear her boots pounding the ground with each angry step she took, and the loud, sharp clang of her fists hitting the metal bars made my blood run cold. It was a sound that echoed throughout the empty street, a sound that screamed that this was no longer a polite conversation, no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was an all-out confrontation. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice rising with each word, becoming more and more desperate. "I've already paid for the buses, and they're here now." She was practically yelling now, her voice laced with panic. The sheer volume of her tone wasn't just an expression of anger. It was a desperate attempt to force me to back down, to make me feel guilty for standing my ground. But I wasn't having any of it. Her words felt empty, manipulative. I wasn't going to let her twist this situation to make me feel responsible for something that wasn't my fault. She didn't get to waltz onto my property with 10 buses full of strangers and expect me to bend to her will. My patience had already been stretched thin, and I wasn't about to let her push me any further. The anger that had been building up in me reached a boiling point. "This is my property," I said, my voice cold and firm, cutting through the tension. "And you're trespassing. If you don't leave, I'll have to call the authorities." The words felt like a shield, like a boundary I was setting in stone. This was the moment where I could no longer be the nice, accommodating neighbor. I had to stand my ground, or else I'd be setting a precedent for this kind of behavior in the future. Her face turned beet red, as if the sheer force of her frustration was manifesting in every inch of her body. She slammed her hands against the gate again, and I could see her veins popping in her neck, her entire body quaking with the force of her anger. But I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. This wasn't about her. This wasn't about her entitlement or her belief that the world owed her something. This was about me, my space, and my right to say no. Behind Karen, the group of elderly guests, many of whom had been sitting casually on my lawn only moments before, were now looking uncomfortable. I could hear the faint murmur of voices spreading through the crowd, a nervous buzz that grew louder by the second. They were realizing, one by one, that this wasn't the pleasant event Karen had painted it to be. They were realizing that they had been dragged into something they didn't fully understand, that they were now part of a confrontation that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with Karen's misplaced sense of entitlement. Some of the guests looked around, as if searching for any sign of an escape. Others were beginning to rise from their chairs, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, hesitant to get involved but unsure of what to do next. I caught a glimpse of some faces, wrinkled with age, but soft with concern, looking over their shoulders toward the street, as if weighing whether it would be worth it to just leave. The realization was starting to settle in that they had been thrust into something completely out of their control. A few of the older men, who had been sitting in folding chairs, exchanged uncertain glances, clearly considering whether they should just pack up and go. Some were clearly uncomfortable with Karen's behavior, their eyes shifting from her to me, as if trying to gauge who the real troublemaker was in this situation. Others, surprisingly, seemed fine with the tension, remaining seated and pretending not to notice the confrontation happening right in front of them. Perhaps they thought it would pass, that Karen would back off. But I knew better. Then one of the guests, an older woman with silver hair and soft eyes, slowly approached the gate. She wasn't rushing to Karen's defense, nor was she looking to escalate things further. She seemed genuinely calm, and for a moment, I almost felt a pang of sympathy for her. She had been dragged into this mess by Karen, and now she was trying to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. "Excuse me," the woman said gently, her voice full of softness, but also laced with a certain polite determination. "Could we just use your yard for a short time?" Her words were careful, measured, as if she didn't want to upset me any further, but at the same time, she was asking for something she knew wasn't hers to ask for. It was an invitation, a request for peace, but one that felt more like a plea for resolution than anything else. Her request, though polite, hit me harder than I had expected. I glanced at her, my mind running a mile a minute, weighing my options. I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the reluctance to cause trouble. She was trying to smooth things over, trying to be reasonable. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about a single moment in time. It was about the principle of it all. The moment I gave in, the moment I allowed anyone to encroach upon my space without permission, I would be opening the door to more of this behavior in the future. I had to stand firm, not just for me, but for everyone who valued the boundaries we all set in our private lives. I looked around at the group. The situation was awkward, uncomfortable. The atmosphere had shifted from festive to tense, the once relaxed picnic now feeling like a political standoff. I could see Karen in the background, still angrily shaking the bars of the gate, her face twisted with frustration. But it was the elderly guests, the ones who had been caught in the crossfire of this absurd situation, that tugged at my heart. They didn't deserve this. But at the same time, I knew that if I gave in now, it would only encourage more people to disregard my boundaries. I could feel the pressure building up, but I wasn't about to back down. I wasn't going to let Karen walk all over me. I wasn't going to let her dictate what happened on my property just because she thought she could. "No," I said firmly, locking eyes with the older woman. My voice was calm but resolute. "I'm locking the gate, and I expect all of you to leave." The words felt final as they left my lips, a definitive stance that I knew would be hard to backtrack from. It wasn't about the guests anymore. It was about maintaining the boundaries that were being so blatantly disregarded. I couldn't allow the situation to spiral out of control. It was uncomfortable, yes, but I had to stand my ground. This was my property. The group of guests, some of whom were still standing, others shifting in their chairs, now looked even more unsure. The older woman who had approached the gate nodded slowly, her expression a mix of understanding and disappointment. She didn't argue, and I could see that she was now quietly turning to leave, her shoulders sagging as she walked back toward the buses. Karen, on the other hand, wasn't done yet. She took a step back from the gate, her fists clenched at her sides, and I could see the storm brewing in her eyes. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but I didn't care. She could be angry. She could scream. She could do whatever she wanted. But the fact remained, this was my space, and no one, not even her, was going to violate that again. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, some of them packing up and leaving, others reluctantly starting to gather their things. The sense of unease in the air was palpable, and as I stood there, locking the gate with a sense of finality, I knew that whatever happened next, I had made the right choice. Karen's face twisted in anger, but she knew, just as I did, that there was no turning back now. With no other choice, Karen finally gave in. I watched as her face turned a deep shade of crimson, her eyes filled with frustration and indignation. She screamed a few choice words at me, words that I'm sure she had been rehearsing in her mind since the moment she first realized I wasn't going to budge. But I didn't care. At that point, her anger felt like nothing more than empty noise, words that held no weight, no power. She had already lost, and she knew it. As she stormed off, her fists clenched tightly by her sides, I stood there, still holding the locked gate firmly in place, watching her walk away. Her group of guests, who had been awkwardly standing around, seemingly unsure of whether to stay or leave, followed her in a subdued, almost defeated procession. The air that had once been full of chatter and laughter was now thick with tension, punctuated only by the sound of Karen's heels clicking angrily against the pavement. She marched ahead of her guests, leading them out of my yard, her posture rigid with frustration. The moment felt surreal. I had won. It was one of those rare, fleeting moments in life where you stand your ground, defy all expectations, and come out on top, even when everything in you wanted to avoid confrontation. It wasn't the way I had wanted things to go. I didn't enjoy the hostility. I didn't want to fight, but I had been pushed to the edge, and there had been no other choice. As Karen disappeared with her group of followers, heading back toward the buses, a strange sense of victory washed over me. It wasn't the kind of victory that felt sweet or satisfying. Instead, it felt like relief. Relief that I had maintained my boundaries. Relief that I hadn't backed down. It was a small but important win, one that reminded me that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to simply stand firm against someone who believes they can walk all over you. But even that small victory came with a price, and as I locked the gate behind me, I knew the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following week, things started to escalate. I had barely settled back into my routine when I noticed a few familiar faces from the neighborhood approaching my house. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe they wanted to stop by for a friendly chat. Maybe they had some questions. But the expressions on their faces were anything but friendly. There was no warmth in their eyes, no casual smiles. Instead, there was a kind of judgment, an undercurrent of disapproval that I could feel weighing down on me as soon as they stepped onto my property. It didn't take long for the complaints to start rolling in. I'd received one message first, then another, and then several more. Neighbors who I had once shared casual conversations with now seemed to avoid me, passing by my house with barely a glance, pretending I wasn't there. Word had spread about what had happened, and suddenly, I was the villain in the story. "You were inconsiderate," one of the neighbors said to me, their voice dripping with judgment. "You could have just let them use your yard for a few hours. Why did you have to make such a big deal out of it?" Their tone was sharp, dismissive, as if my refusal to allow strangers on my property was a personal affront to their sense of community. Another neighbor called me up one afternoon. "You could have handled it better," they told me, their voice tight with reproach. "Everyone in the neighborhood knows Karen. You've just made things worse for yourself." The pressure was mounting, but what was worse than the direct complaints was the coldness that started to seep into every interaction. It was subtle at first. People would give me curt nods or half-hearted greetings as they passed by, but there was no warmth in their smiles, no invitation to converse. I had been painted as the villain, the one who had caused trouble, the one who had made a fuss over something so insignificant. In their eyes, I had disrupted the peace, taken something harmless and blown it out of proportion. As the week dragged on, I couldn't escape the feeling of isolation that grew with each passing day. The phone calls, the whispers, the sideways glances, they were all reminders that standing my ground had come at a cost. Even the people who had once been friendly, who had waved as they passed by or stopped for a quick chat, were now keeping their distance, like they were afraid of being seen with me. It was like I had become a pariah in my own neighborhood. I could feel the weight of it every time I left the house, every time I walked down the street and saw the neighbors glance away. It was hard not to internalize their judgment, to feel like maybe, just maybe, I had done something wrong. But then I would remind myself, I hadn't done anything wrong. Sure, I had stood up to Karen, but in my mind, that wasn't the problem. The problem was that Karen had thought she could just walk into my life, my home, and dictate the terms of what happened on my property. The problem was that I had to fight to maintain my boundaries, to preserve my autonomy in the face of someone who thought their entitlement was all that mattered. I hadn't been rude. I hadn't been inconsiderate. I had simply said no. Despite the pressure to conform to the unspoken rules of the neighborhood, I refused to apologize for that. Still, the guilt crept in. When Karen's loyal followers began calling me names, selfish, unfriendly, rude, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of doubt. Was I really the bad guy here? Was I being too stubborn, too inflexible? Couldn't I have just let it slide for one afternoon? Let them enjoy a few hours on my lawn? But then I would picture Karen's smug face, standing at the gate, demanding that I give up my space, because she believed she could. And in that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. I had not given in. I had not let her dictate what happened on my property. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Even as the whispers continued, and even as I was labeled the villain by people who had no idea what it was like to be on the receiving end of Karen's wrath, I stood firm. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to apologize for asserting my boundaries. I had every right to say no. It was frustrating, yes. It was isolating, even more so. But it was also empowering. And as the days went by, I began to realize something important. When you stand up for yourself, when you refuse to let others trample over your boundaries, there will always be those who try to make you feel guilty. They'll call you names. They'll accuse you of being rude, or inconsiderate, or difficult. But those voices don't matter. What matters is knowing that you did the right thing for yourself. And that's something no one can take away from you. So, when Karen's supporters tried to paint me as the villain, I didn't care. I had already won. And in my heart, I knew that standing my ground had been the only choice. What Karen didn't understand is that just because someone is part of an HOA doesn't mean they can dictate the actions of others. This whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson in standing up for myself, even when someone tries to walk all over me. The HOA Karen may have thought she could intimidate me, but I proved that no one has the right to control my property or my life, not even a so-called community leader. And from that day forward, I learned that sometimes the best way to handle situations like these is simply to lock the gate and leave them outside, waiting. And as for the HOA, well, they learned not to mess with me again.